Greetings, friends. This is Ruslan Baylov reporting. Today is February 1st. According to the plan, today should have marked the beginning of another round of negotiations between Russia and Ukraine in the territory of the United Arab Emirates. However, as of the time of recording this material, no official confirmation has been received that the negotiations are actually starting. Parallel to this, the so-called energy truce expires today. Therefore, as they say, we will be closely watching the development of events. Combat operations on the front line continue, and we, as always, continue to analyze the current situation in detail. So friends, today is the first day of a new month, which means it is high time to summarize the results of the past period. In this case, we are talking about the completed January, the first month of 2026. But before moving on to the general results of the month, let us briefly focus on the results of the past 24 hours. As serious and very noticeable advances were recorded during this time, there were quite a few of them, and, what is especially important, 3 settlements were taken under control at once. Let us start in order. In the Sumi region, Russian units have practically completed the clearing of the Mikhail tract on the new bridgehead. In addition, the troops reached the outskirts of the village of Kharkiv and did not just approach it, but actually entered the settlement from the eastern direction. If we speak about the main bridgehead in the Sumi region, an entry into Kondratovka was recorded there, specifically from 2 directions, both from the north and from the south. In the Kharkiv region, for the first time in perhaps a year and a half, the Liptsi direction has become noticeably more active. Moreover, we are talking not just about an increase in combat activity, but about the capture of a full-fledged settlement, the village of Zelenoye. In this sector of the front, settlements had not come under the control of the Russian army for more than a year and a half. In the Volchansk direction, it was possible to advance in the area of Volchanskye Khutora. In the Degtyanoye zone, units entered the village of Krugloye. At the Melovoye bridgehead, an entry into Chugunovka was recorded. Furthermore, south of Dvorechnaya, the advance amounted to a section about 3.5 kilometers wide. However, one of the key events of the past 24 hours is again connected with the Kupiansk direction. A large amount of contradictory information and outright disinformation is currently circulating around Kupiansk-Uzlovoy. The Ukrainian side claims full control over the settlement, while the Russian side makes statements about control by Russian troops. The real picture, as often happens, lies somewhere in the middle. Both Russian units and forces of the armed forces of Ukraine are present in Kupiansk-Uzlovoy. At the same time, over the past 24 hours, the first footage of objective control appeared from the northern part of Kupiansk-Uzlovoy, and these are precisely the first confirmed materials from the Russian side, directly from this settlement. These frames allow us to assert with confidence the northern part of Kupiansk-Uzlovoy is under the control of Russian troops. As for the rest of the territory of the urban-type settlement, fierce battles continue there. Ukrainian units are noticeably losing their stability. We already analyzed in detail yesterday their serious collapse in an area of about 20 square kilometers near Petropavlovka. Now a similar situation is observed in the area of Kupiansk-Uzlovoy. In my opinion, the further fate of this sector is virtually a foregone conclusion. Yes, the official statements may have been somewhat premature. After all, it is only correct to declare a settlement completely taken when there is stable and indisputable control. However, we have the situation as it stands at the moment. Speaking of other directions, the fighters of the center group have finally finished off the village of Toretskoye. This was the last settlement of the so-called Shakovskoye fortified area. Now we can say that this entire fortified area has completely passed under the control of the Russian army. The logical continuation will be further advancement in the direction of Pavlovka, then Torskoye and Kraiskoye, with the prospect of reaching Druzhkovka. Another settlement was taken in the Zaporizhzhia region, in the area of responsibility of the Vostok Group. We are talking about the village of Sviatopetrovka. This allows for increased pressure on the Verkhnaya Tersa, Zaliznichnoye road. It is extremely important to finish off Zaliznichnoye, as this particular fortified section significantly hinders the further advance of the Russian army toward Orakov. At the same time, it is worth noting that at the moment, The armed forces of Ukraine are still managing to hold the defense in this sector. Thus, summarizing the past 24 hours, we can say the following. 3 settlements and about 28.6 square kilometers of territory were taken under control. As you can see, the end of the month for the Russian army turned out to be very productive and impactful. Now we move on to the results of January as a whole and, what is especially important, to the prospects for February. Traditionally, we begin with the northern direction, Sumi region. In January, a new bridgehead was formed here. Formally, it can be called a mini bridgehead, but in fact it turned out to be quite serious. The width of the section where Russian troops advanced at the new point of entry exceeds 10 kilometers. During the month, the 2 settlements were taken, Komarovka and Belaya Berioza, and an entry into Kharkovka was also carried out. I do not see any large-scale prospects for February here. The North Group will most likely continue systematic pressure, stretching the forces of the armed forces of Ukraine. Perhaps by the end of February, it will be possible to completely finish clearing the Mikhail tract, gain a foothold in Kharkovka, and probably reach the village of Sidorovka. That is, we are talking primarily about expanding the control zone in width. An excellent result would also be advancement in depth, for example entering Ulanovo, but such a scenario still looks unlikely. Although it is worth remembering that the very fact of creating this bridgehead in January was not expected by many. On the main Sumi bridgehead, no serious events were observed during the month. The front as a whole remained static. The control zone was slightly expanded from Andreevka and Alexeyevka in the southern direction, and at the very end of the month, we managed to catch on to Kondratovka. At the Grabovskoye bridgehead, the situation also remained relatively stable. Control was expanded slightly to the west toward Ryasnoye, but it has not yet been possible to enter the settlement itself. Perhaps in February we will see either an entry into or the capture of Ryasnoye. Overall, this concludes the Sumi region. During January, just over 15 square kilometers of territory passed under Russian control here, which, by the way, is more than in December. At the same time, the armed forces of Ukraine did not advance in any sector in the Sumi region during this period. Moving on to the Kharkiv region. For many, the mention of this region immediately brings to mind Kupiansk, and the impression is created that things are going poorly for the Russian army in the Kharkiv region. This is an absolutely mistaken perception. To understand the scale, in January the Kharkiv region took second place in terms of the rate of advancement of Russian troops, second only to the Donetsk region. Even the Zaporizhzhia region, where the Vostok and Dnieper groups operate, remained behind. What happened here in January? On the mini bridgehead, Sotnitsky Kazachok was taken, although this advance did not receive further development. The Liptsy direction became more active, where the village of Zelenoy was taken. In the Volchansk sector, the month passed quite successfully. Staritsa was finished off and returned to control. The forest area south of Prilipka was cleared, Grafskoye was entered, Semenovka was taken under control, and the pocket between Liman and Vilcha was eliminated. Which areas can be called disappointing? From Vilcha in the southern direction, the front failed to move at all during the month. There were no advances there. In addition, in the area of Volchanskia Khutora, the advancement turned out to be minimal, and in general, the rates there are comparable to those previously observed in Volchansk itself. What to expect in February? Grafskoye will undoubtedly be finished off. There are practically no alternatives here. Perhaps, based on the results of the month, it will be possible to reach Verkhnyaya Pisarevka. There is also reason to believe that the front will begin to move slowly away from the southern outskirts of Vilcha. Next is the Melovoy bridgehead. There were few events here. The main one was the entry into Chugunovka, as well as advancement south of Ambanoy with the clearing of 2 forest areas and the closing of a small pocket in the area of Dvorezhnaya. Further south, the situation was more dynamic. Advances were recorded in sections 7, 4 and 3.5 kilometers wide, and a breakthrough into Kutkovka was also carried out. In fact, a trade-off occurred. The armed forces of Ukraine were able to push back Russian units in one section, but at the same time, they themselves significantly slumped specifically in the area of Kutkovka. And of course, the Kupiansk sector, which everyone is talking about today. There is a persistent opinion that everything is going poorly for the Russian army here, but this does not correspond to reality. Yeah, there are indeed problems on the right bank of the Oskol, which is clearly visible on the map. In January, Russian units were pushed back from Moskovka, from the Yubileyny microdistrict, and partially from the central part of Kupiansk. However, if you look at the left bank of the Oskol, the picture is cardinally different. There, a colossal slump occurred for the armed forces of Ukraine. The entire defense system, which they, it is important to note, successfully held for more than a year, has actually collapsed. The depth of advancement of Russian troops both in the Petropavlovka area and in the Kupiansk-Uzlovoy area amounted to about 10 kilometers. To speak specifically, pockets with strong points were cleared. Petropavlovka completely passed under control, a significant part of Podoly and Kurilovka has been cleared, and entry and consolidation in Kupiansk-Uzlovoy were carried out. Such is the result of January, and it exceeded all my expectations. Now about the prospects for February. Ideally, during this month, the Russian army needs to maintain control over at least the northern part of right bank Kupiansk and simultaneously expand the flanks slightly. This is key task number 1 on the right bank, to hold on in Kupiansk. The second task is to take Kucherovka. The third is to completely finish clearing Podoly and Kurilovka. And a 5+ level result would be a situation in which, at the end of February, Kupiansk-Uzlovoy is under full, stable and, most importantly, indisputable control of Russian troops. What else happened in the Kharkiv region during January? By and large, there were few significant changes. Only in the area of Novaya Krugliakovka was it possible to slightly expand the control zone. But the Borovaya direction, in essence, can again be considered frozen. No advances were recorded there in January, at least within the Kharkiv region. If we summarize for the region as a whole, the picture looks as follows. The armed forces of Ukraine did not take a single settlement in a month and advanced by approximately 10 square kilometers. The Russian army, in turn, established control over 5 settlements and 137.7 square kilometers of territory. Therefore, let us once again ask ourselves the question, is the Russian army really failing in the Kharkiv region? The numbers speak for themselves. 10 square kilometers for the armed forces of Ukraine against 137 for the Russian army. Moving further, in the Luhansk region, an advance also took place in January, but it was minimal, approximately 2.5 square kilometers. Now, the Donetsk region. In the Liman direction, Russian units entered Alexandrovka, entered Svyatogorsk, and reached the northeastern outskirts of Liman. At the same time, a withdrawal from Masliakovka occurred. However, an entry into Liman from the southern direction was carried out simultaneously. Battles for the city continue. Furthermore, the troops entered Ozernoye and Zakotnoye. The Rai-Alexandrovka direction deserves special mention, as it performed quite confidently in January. Zakotnoye was taken, units managed to reach the central part of the settlement in Reznikovka. The front line was pushed back approximately 7 kilometers from Pereyazdnoye, and a dash of about 5 kilometers was made with an entry into Nikiforovka. As for the prospects for February, an entry into Kryvyi Luki, the conclusion of the battles for Reznikovka, and an advance toward Kaliniki are expected here. I am more than confident that by the end of the month, Bondanoye and Kromovka will also be finished off, and possibly Nikiforovka as well. Thus, by the beginning of March, the Russian army may well have positions already on the approaches to Rai-Alexandrovka. Undoubtedly, advancement will also continue in the pockets between Zakotnoye and Reznikovka, as well as between Reznikovka and Nikiforovka. However, one should not expect rapid breakthroughs there. The sector is difficult, saturated with heights and serious defensive positions. The Kramatorsk sector of the front deserves separate attention. In January, it literally came to life after a long lull. 2 settlements were taken here, Privolye and Novomarkovo, and entries into Minkovka and Markovo were carried out. Yes, in quantitative terms, the results here are more modest than in the Liman or Rai-Alexandrovka directions, but it is important to consider that the front line here had stood still for years. Now we are seeing a clear and serious intensification. What should be expected from February in the Kramatorsk direction? It is quite likely that it will be possible to finish off Minkovka and Golubovka. These are extremely important and difficult fortified areas, the storming of which lasted for almost 2 years, and only now has real progress emerged. In addition, the pocket between Privolye and Bondonoye will most likely be cleared. Moving on to the Konstantinovka sector, noticeable successes were also achieved here in January. From the northern direction, units entered Novodmitrovka. In Konstantinovka itself, a gradual advance continues in the residential sector as well as in the area of the railway station. From the south, it was possible to break through the defense of the armed forces of Ukraine in the area of the reservoir, clear a significant territory, and take the village of Berostok. I do not expect any large-scale breakthroughs in February in this sector. One should certainly not count on the fall of the city, as some sources predict. The advancement will be gradual in nature, cutting the flanks and slow movement within the urban areas. Perhaps it will be possible to finish off Ilyinovka or Novodmitrovka, but even that is not guaranteed. The sector is extremely difficult, and there is a huge number of defensive structures here. Serious changes will occur when it is possible to take Stepanovka and Dolgaya Balka, as well as reach Kraiskoye and further to Druzhkovka. However, that is a prospect for the middle of spring or even the beginning of summer. Now for the Dobropilya direction. Here, it was possible to finish off Toretskoye and complete the clearing of Shakovo. At the same time, control over Volnoye was lost. Russian troops also entered Novyi Donbass and Belitskoye. It is precisely in this sector that the prospects for February look especially promising. I am practically certain that good news regarding Belitskoye will appear in February. Moreover, I do not rule out that by the end of the month, the city may pass under Russian control. Also, we will likely see an entry into Kucherev Yar again. Volnoy will be returned. And the front line from Rodinskoye will begin to gradually shift to the west, while from Pokrovsk it will shift to the north. In general, this sector promises to be one of the most productive in February. What else regarding the Donetsk region? To the west of Pokrovsk, in the Grishino area, the situation remains difficult. There was no noticeable progress there during the month. However, north of Nudaknoye and in the Kotlino area, the control zone was significantly expanded. The troops reached the approaches to Sergeyevka and established full control over the Pokrovskaya mine. In total, the picture for the Donetsk region is as follows. The armed forces of Ukraine were able to recapture one settlement and occupy about 4 square kilometers of territory. The Russian army, in turn, took 7 settlements and approximately 207 square kilometers. The comparison is telling, 207 against 4, moving to the Dnipropetrovsk region. Here, January turned out to be not the most active month. Control was expanded in Novopodgorodnoye, a pocket along the border to the east of Novopavlovka was cleared, and the clearing of the section between Novopavlovka and Ivanovka continues. This is the area of responsibility of the Center Group. In the sector of the Vostok Group, the month was mostly spent on the defensive, and the only result was the capture of the village of Berestskoye. That is essentially all. In February, intensification is expected primarily at the junction of the Zaporizhzhia and Dnipropetrovsk regions. This is necessary to cover Ternovatoye from possible counterattacks. However, there will be no large-scale offensive similar to what we observed several months earlier. The main forces are now concentrated further south in the Zaporizhzhia region. The total for the Dnipropetrovsk region for January, 1 settlement and 38 square kilometers under the control of the Russian army. No advances were recorded for the armed forces of Ukraine. That leaves the Zaporizhzhia region. Here, fierce battles for the defense line along the Gaichur River went on all month, and in the end, the Russian army, specifically the Vostok Group, achieved success. The defense line was broken across its entire width, and the line of military contact is gradually shifting from Gulye-Pole in a western direction. The main problem remains in the area of the urban-type settlement of Zaliznichnoye. Here, the offensive ran into a defense node that has not yet been overcome. As for the prospects for February, if the current pace is maintained, the Vostok Group will at least reach the railway line across its entire width. In a more optimistic scenario, There are chances to reach the defense line along the villages of Verkhnaya Tersa, Vozdvizhenka, Rojdestvenka, and perhaps even enter Rojdestvenskoye and Verkhnaya Tersa. If this can be implemented in February, the result can be rated as a solid 5+. As for Zaliznychnoye, I am confident that by the end of the month, this defense node will be cracked, which will open the road for a spring offensive in the direction of Orakov. By the way, regarding the Orakov sector, here the front remains stable, as expected. The only notable event was the capture of the village of Belogorye in early January, and active operations effectively ended there. However, in the Zaporizhzhia direction, the month, on the contrary, turned out to be very productive. Units of the Dnieper group took 3 settlements and formed an advanced sector in the shape of a rectangle, about 4 kilometers wide and more than 6 kilometers deep. What to expect in February? Most likely, Magdalinovka and Zapasnoye will be taken, and attempts to level the front line in the area of Primorskoye will continue. Primorskoye itself will likely be finally cleared, after which pressure will increase toward Rekhnoy and Veselyanka. It is difficult to say how all this will end. The sector is extremely complicated. Perhaps a serious breakthrough will not occur. But considering that entries into Rekhnoy are already being recorded, including by Ukrainian sources, there is reason to believe that during the month, this sector will still be finished off. Summarizing the overall total for January, the following can be noted. The general pace of advancement decreased by 11% compared to December, and this is an absolutely normal phenomenon. In January, paces traditionally fall. This was the case in 2024. It was the case in 2025, and the year 2026 was no exception. If we speak of dry statistics, during January, the Russian army took 24 settlements and 503.6 square kilometers of territory. For the armed forces of Ukraine, the drop in pace turned out to be much more drastic. While for the Russian troops, the decrease was 11%, for the Ukrainian side it was a full 65%. In December, they occupied 42 square kilometers, and in January, only 14. The comparison is more than clear, 503 against 14. All attempts by the armed forces of Ukraine to influence the overall pace of the Russian army in this case look like nothing more than a statistical error. Regarding expectations for February, frankly speaking, the pace will likely decrease even further. This also happened in previous years. Both in 2024 and in 2025, paces also slowed down in February. Therefore, if the Russian troops manage to stay in the range of 450 to 500 square kilometers, it will be a result of a 5+ level. This is a very good indicator. A scenario in the area of 350 to 400 square kilometers looks more realistic. For comparison, in February of last year, only 220 square kilometers were taken, and so any result above that mark can be considered successful, as it will mean maintaining a pace higher than last year's. At the moment, it can be confidently recorded, January 2026 has become the most productive January in terms of the rate of advancement of the Russian army for the entire period of the conflict. In January of last year, 412 square kilometers were taken, and in January 2024, only about 30. Imagine, there were times when as much was taken in an entire month as is now taken in a single day. In the last 24 hours alone, about 28 square kilometers were taken, whereas for the entire month of January 2024, it was 30. The trend from year to year is obvious, and it is clearly developing in favor of the Russian army. On this note, today's episode comes to a close. It turned out to be voluminous and packed with information. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your comments.